In the largest grain elevator in America, a spark causes dust to ignite and explode with terrifying intensity. Workers are severely burned and trapped inside the collapsed structure. When firefighters get the call, they know they are in for a fight.
My reaction was disbelief. I couldn't believe that there was that much destruction on that elevator.
The government declares it a national emergency. Family members pray for their loved ones, and medical personnel prepare for the worst.
Everything that we're going to need for that patient, we have ready.
Rescuers know that they must succeed, especially when seconds count. June 1998, almost harvest time in Kansas. Over the next 3 weeks, an entire season's wheat would be harvested and trucked to grain elevators for storage. Rising from the plains, the grain elevators are the largest man-made structures in the prairie states. There are 900 in Kansas alone. About 4 miles southwest of Wichita is one of the world's largest, a vast complex of 246 silos. They hold 20 million bushels, enough wheat to bake bread for every person in America for 6 weeks. Farm work is one of the most hazardous industries in America. Every year, almost 200,000 agriculture workers suffer disabling injuries. They are more likely to die on the job than workers in any other profession. But like many grain men, 37-year-old Scott Mosteller loved the work. He and his close friends Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen operated the elevator's nerve center. In the span of a few weeks, they would orchestrate the movement of more grain than many nations produce in a year. Inside, miles of conveyor belts and machinery process hundreds of thousands of bushels each hour. Machinery that must be maintained meticulously. With the upcoming harvest, workers were summoned to prepare machinery for what promised to be a bumper crop. Elaine Caldwell, an accountant, arrived with her husband Paul, who had been called back to work. 65-year-old Howard Going, who had retired the previous August, couldn't pass up a chance to work another harvest. Elaine Caldwell kept track of workers added to the payroll. Beneath the silos, wheat is constantly moving. This underground network of conveyor belts stretches nearly a mile. Conveyor belts pass over roller bearings. If even one of the 12,000 bearings in the complex seized up, it could overheat and cause a spark. One spark can be deadly. Grain dust, mixed in proper proportions with oxygen, can be as explosive as dynamite, 8 times more volatile than gasoline. Dangers were all around. A single spark can ignite the grain dust, causing a catastrophic explosion. In grain elevators, danger is ever present. Workers can be crushed by trucks or by freight trains. Massive, constantly moving machinery can sever limbs or crush hands. Even to get to their posts, some workers must ascend a vertical conveyor belt that rises 200 feet. Johnny Sutton, Scott Mosteller, and Lanny Owen work near the top of the head house, a 197-foot tall concrete tower that rises between the silos. Howard Going worked below, in tunnels 20 feet underground. Workers reach many areas of the elevators by a series of catwalks. One wrong step, and it's a 200-foot plunge to their deaths. The non-air-conditioned tunnels swelter at over 100 degrees on hot spring and summer days. But the biggest fear was fire. Workers checked and greased thousands of bearings to make sure none overheated and ignited highly explosive grain dust. But they missed one. At about 9:20 that morning, Howard Going heard a sound that made his heart stop. A bearing in an adjoining tunnel had seized and overheated, igniting grain dust. The initial blast set off a deadly chain reaction. The explosion shook up more grain dust, which ignited, setting off even larger explosions. Scott Mosteller heard a clang.
Hey guys, that didn't sound really good.
Worried, he looked down. He leapt to the floor, covering his face as a 2,000-degree fireball rocketed through the head house tower, blowing out the walls. A trucker picking up a load of grain heard the first muffled blasts. Moments later, the structure blew apart, destroying his truck and nearly blinding him. The explosion was so loud, it could be heard for 15 miles. Sedgwick County Dispatcher Vanessa Downey was on duty that morning.
It was pretty quiet that day, just your normal car stops, banning vehicles, and then all of a sudden, boom. This guy called and says, oh my God, it's big. And he really couldn't say what had happened. All he knew is that the grain elevator had exploded. He said, you just can't imagine what it's like.
Sedgwick County Fire Chief Gary Kermode took the call from dispatch, but alarmed citizens flooded the lines.
We'd received about 110 phone calls within the first half hour, and then it kept continuing, and then it came in as a grain elevator explosion with people missing and or trapped.
6 fire stations and 2 rescue teams responded. Nothing prepared them for the devastation they saw. Lieutenant John Troyer, one of the first to the scene, recalls.
When the elevator first came into view, it was an amazing sight. You could tell there was large sections that were blown away. There was smoke rising. I couldn't believe that there was that much destruction on that elevator. And I turned to my lieutenant and I said, we're going to be here a very, very long time.
Inside the destroyed structure, workers dug themselves from the smoldering rubble. Elaine Caldwell suffered bruises, lacerations, and burns, but worried most about her husband at the top of the silo. She made her way out, stunned by what she saw. Other workers, staggered, burned, and bloody. Rooms that she had walked through moments before were unrecognizable, filled with smoke, flames, chunks of concrete, and twisted metal. When firefighters arrived, the area looked like a war zone.
We saw people running. We saw people kind of walking around in shock. We were concerned concrete and rebar that was hanging off the silos might collapse. We had 40 to 60 mile an hour winds, and so we still had a 3 to 4 foot movement of that, what we call the head house, where we think the explosion occurred, and that was moving about 3 to 4 feet too. So we had several considerations there to protect our rescue workers, number one, and get the people in the perimeter outside of that.
Fires continued to burn. Huge sections of the structure were in ruins, and some silos bulged out, the concrete riddled with massive cracks. The explosions had traveled the length of the complex, blasting out both ends. Grain continued to burst into flames, and debris continued to fall. After evaluating the risk, Chief Kermode coordinated rescue operations. Firefighters learned that several men were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below the ground.
Rescue, we divided into several areas. One was what we call the walking wounded, people that were injured, and we did a quick triage of those. And we sorted out the patients and determined which ones needed emergency help, less injured, those type of things. We sorted them out by category.
In the head house, Johnny Sutton was badly burned. He radioed his position. A co-worker who escaped with minor injuries heard the transmission.
We're gonna try to get out of the head house.
Sutton helped dig out Lanny Owen.
Come on, we're gonna make it. Yeah. Come on.
The walls around them shook and swayed. "18-inch slabs of concrete were pulverized. Scott Mosteller was blown to the back wall of the obliterated scale office. Mosteller was surprised that he was still alive.
A lot of times the top part of the head house is just gone completely, or it collapses. So I honestly, from the time it exploded, thought that was it. I felt pain over my whole body, and I was just trying to, since I'd never gone through anything like that before, I was afraid I was gonna pass out or go into shock.
Mosteller couldn't find his friends. To get out, he had to cross over mangled catwalks and collapsing sections of the concrete floor. When he reached a rooftop, he could hear sirens coming from miles around. Sutton helped Owen reach a spot where they wouldn't be crushed by falling girders or concrete. Elaine Caldwell pleaded for firefighters to find her husband on top of the massive complex. At the south end, Paul Caldwell lay injured and alone. Firefighters had to figure out how to rescue stranded workers from burning towers that looked close to collapse. Monday, June 8th, 1998, Wichita, Kansas. Firefighters responded to an explosion at one of the world's largest grain elevators. Grain dust ignited like dynamite, blasting through the structure. A series of massive fireballs destroyed much of the complex. Workers remained stranded on the still burning towers. Others were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below the ground. People for miles around heard the blast. Dispatchers were flooded with calls. Among the first relatives to hear about the blast was Tom Mosteller, whose son Scott was stranded near the top of the concrete tower.
This is Tom, go ahead. The explosion had blown his hard hat off and his walkie-talkie off, but he had his cell phone inside his coveralls, his personal cell phone, and he didn't call until he got out to the top of one of the silos, and it was about 17 minutes after the explosion, so I said, I'll call you right back. I said, I've got to get a few things in motion, and I'll head that way.
Scott told his father that he was badly burned, but that rescue workers had arrived. By mid-morning, firefighters from Nebraska and Oklahoma arrived to help fight the blaze and rescue the trapped workers. Roads were blocked by panicked relatives trying to get to the scene. Sedgwick County deputies stopped them at a roadblock and did their best to keep them informed. But they kept coming. Authorities needed a place where family members and loved ones could gather to await news. Rescue workers directed them to a nearby elementary school that many of the workers' children attended. Grief-stricken family members gathered around the television, horrified by the images. Rescue personnel updated them each hour. The news was grim. Firefighters quickly found the bodies of 2 men killed by the blast. One victim's clothes had been almost completely blown off. EMT Bill Ochterlony helped treat the injured workers.
When we put together a triage area, we look at number of criticals and number of non-criticals. We try to divide those out into two separate groups. With the critical patients, we want to move those right away.
The burns had to be treated immediately. EMTs poured saline solution over sterile sheets to prevent potentially lethal dehydration. Rescue workers soon learned that 19 men were at the elevator at the time of the blast. Sections of the massive structure were destroyed or dangerously close to collapse. Fires continued to burn, and piles of wheat spontaneously burst into flames. Tom Mosteller managed to get through to the site and told firefighters he had spoken to his son by phone. His son, he told them, was badly burned, stranded near the top of the head house. Elaine Caldwell, an accountant injured in the blast, implored firefighters to search for her husband Paul, who had been working on the top of the silos. Trapped near the top of the head house tower, Johnny Sutton reached firefighters on his two-way radio. Sutton told rescuers that he and Lanny Owen were injured on a rooftop near the scale office. Both were badly burned. Sutton also heard someone calling from the floor above. Firefighters now knew that at least 4 survivors were trapped in the concrete tower that rose between the silos. None of the departments in Kansas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma had ladders long enough to reach the top of the structure. Medical rescue organizations and even media outlets offered choppers, but Chief Kermode knew they wouldn't help.
Normally, helicopters are not always the best to use on a site. They have to be designed for it. They have to have a hoist. A lot of the media helicopters, they offered those helicopters to us. They offered us the Life Watch and Eagle Med helicopters to us. The problem is they're not designed to rescue people off buildings.
Desperate, rescue workers sought help from the Army Medical Unit at Fort Riley, Kansas. The unit, designed to set up mobile wartime hospitals, dispatched a rescue helicopter. At the burn center at Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, nurses and doctors monitored the rescue efforts, knowing victims would soon arrive. They prepared for the worst. Burn nurse Rhonda Young.
I knew from watching what was on TV that there were some significantly burned patients coming in. We have a very systematic approach. We start with what we call the ABCs. A is for airway, B is for breathing, C is for circulation. And you treat every patient the same way. Reason being is that you don't want to miss anything.
When the victims arrived, they suffered not only traumatic injuries caused by the violent explosion, but also life-threatening burns. The fireball scorched exposed skin instantaneously. Survivors were covered with gashes and bruises from flying debris. At 11:30, a combat rescue helicopter from Fort Riley's 82nd Medical Company arrived to help get the stranded workers. Paul Caldwell, alone at the far end of the complex, waved desperately to attract their attention. Crew members scanned the quarter-mile-long complex looking for survivors. Finally, they spotted him. Gusting winds made this rescue especially treacherous. Even under normal conditions, helicopter rescues require tremendous skill and coordination. If the pilot didn't maintain a steady altitude and position, the medic could slam into the structure with enough force to kill him. The hurricane-like prop wash could also transform chunks of concrete and metal into deadly projectiles. Elaine Caldwell watched, praying they could reach her injured husband. When she saw him rise, she was overjoyed. Paul Caldwell was critically injured. But he was alive. But other badly injured men remained stranded on the rooftops. The Fort Riley soldiers spotted Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen. But as the helicopter descended, prop wash caused concrete walls to sway and crack. Hope of a quick rescue was dashed. Fearing they would be crushed, Johnny Sutton waved them off. EMT Bill Ochterlony recalls.
Probably the most difficult part was the 4 men that were in the scale room at the top of the head house. We had radio contact with them, and they, over time, progressively got weaker.
Firefighters had to find a way to reach the injured men before time ran out. A deadly explosion at one of the world's largest grain elevators left desperate workers trapped on top of the burning structure. None of the fire stations in Kansas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma had equipment that could reach the top. A helicopter rescue was waved off when prop wash nearly knocked down concrete walls that would have crushed the injured men. But tenacious firefighters found another way. They commandeered a 175-foot crane that had been moving equipment at a nearby power plant. With stranded workers fading fast, firefighters feared they might arrive too late. Sedgwick County Fire Lieutenant John Troyer.
We had to move rail cars to get the crane in place, and then we needed to set up the crane, which of course had very large outriggers. And then to get the crews in place and brief them on what we needed done, and to get them to the top took a long period of time.
Rescuers faced another nightmare in the smoldering bowels of the grain elevator. 4 men were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below ground. Rescuers needed to get them out. The tunnels were hot, well over 100 degrees, pitch black, and so choked with smoke and grain dust that breathing filters clogged in minutes. At any moment, grain dust could ignite, killing anyone inside. A dog from Kansas Search and Rescue was enlisted to help find the men in the massive complex. Built to withstand the pressure of millions of tons of concrete above, the tunnels now creaked and groaned as if they might give way, crushing everyone inside. Even a minor collapse would trap rescuers. The canine search got off to an ominous start. Trained search dogs communicate to their handlers with distinctive barks. This bark indicated that the dog detected human remains, not a survivor. Somewhere nearby, entombed beneath the smoldering rubble, lay another victim. In the head house, survivors worried that rescuers might not reach them soon enough. During the blast, Scott Mosteller had covered his face with his hands. His hands were so badly burned that the skin was charred. But they didn't feel hot. They felt ice cold. Tom Mosteller, who stayed in touch by cell phone, thought his son was showing classic symptoms of shock, a prime killer of burn victims.
He just said that he was very cold and he wanted to go to sleep. And I said, no, Scott, you can't go to sleep because we're going to need to communicate with you. We need to find out where you're at and what information you've got about the other fellows and this type of thing. And I said, so just don't go to sleep. I said, I'll just keep calling you, though.
At the base of the elevator, rescuers methodically cleared debris. And anchored the huge outriggers that would keep the crane from tipping over. Finally, they were ready. The crane hoisted the men more than 130 feet, the crane arm rocking in the gusting wind. The gargantuan concrete headhouse tower was almost destroyed. Sedgwick County Fire Lieutenant John Troyer.
The scene in there was amazing. 18-inch concrete with 1-inch reinforced rebar every 6 inches, and it was completely blown away. There was huge holes in the floors of the head house of the elevator, and the amount of destruction was just amazing. I mean, there was virtually nothing left. Huge cracks in the concrete floors, and making our way through there was dangerous.
Johnny Sutton feared he and Lanny Owen wouldn't last much longer. Lanny was in bad shape. When the explosion hit, he was looking down. His face took the full force of the 2,000-degree fireball. But moving even 20 feet put the lives of rescuers in jeopardy. nothing was stable. Winds made the structure rock. At any moment, it could go down. By the time they reached Sutton and Owen, the men were weak and in agonizing pain.
Every part of the exposed skin was burned to the 3rd degree. Of course, they probably had inhalation burns too, which is very, very serious and dangerous. We tried to get them out as quick as we could and also be safe.
Wind gusts had picked up. If they took one wrong step, they would plunge more than 100 feet into fires still burning below. They clutched Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen, moving methodically back to the crane. Rescuers hoped they had reached them in time. Tom Mosteller kept his son updated, filling him in on details of the rescue.
Over here!
But Scott's hands were shivering, and he was growing increasingly sleepy. The father assured his son help was on the way. He had to hang on. But the crane bucket was still at the silo tops, several floors below Scott. Rescuers had to scale part of the destroyed headhouse tower to reach him. Scott Mosteller feared that if he drifted off, he would never wake up.
I was afraid I was going to pass out or go into shock, so I just tried to stay awake. I looked down to see if my Jeep had been hit with any concrete, just anything like that to take my mind off of it.
From the command post below, Tom Mosteller and firefighters spotted rescuers emerging on the rooftop where Scott sat. To get Scott Mosteller back to the level of the crane's basket, firefighters had to use ropes and belaying gear designed to rescue mountain climbers. Scott Mosteller's burns were excruciating. The climbing ropes tore into burned skin. A medevac chopper was immediately dispatched. Like Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen, Scott Mosteller was taken immediately to a waiting medevac chopper. All 3 men had lost massive amounts of fluids through their charred skin. They needed immediate medical attention. At Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, doctors and nurses knew it would be a long, hard struggle to keep these men alive. On June 8, 1998, doctors at the burn center at Via Christi St. Francis Hospital prepared to save the lives of badly burned workers plucked from the top of a grain elevator near Wichita, Kansas. The workers had been stranded for hours while rescuers struggled to reach them. Their horrific burns were encrusted with soot and debris, increasing the likelihood of lethal infections. With burns this serious, treatment should begin immediately. their fight for survival had only begun. Burn nurse Rhonda Young was part of the treatment team.
The natural response physiologically to a burn injury is massive swelling. If they have facial burns, they're going to swell even more in the facial area. So that alone can compromise your airway. So you need to preserve that airway. That's an initial concern. That's a life-threatening concern. If you don't have an airway, you don't have a patient.
Dehydration can also be deadly. Fluid loss through burns can deplete the blood, depriving the brain and vital organs of oxygen. Lanny Owen, Johnny Sutton, and Scott Mosteller were all listed in critical condition. Even as they were treated, they asked about the men trapped in tunnels 20 feet below ground. The explosions left the tunnels clogged with wheat, mangled chunks of metal, and shards of concrete. The wheat itself posed a grave danger. It can engulf a man like quicksand. It also produces nitrogen dioxide, or silo gas, that can kill in minutes. Fires continued to smolder throughout the complex. Rescuers knew that another grain dust explosion could kill them all. But they remained hopeful after several rescuers reported hearing someone banging on a pipe. As the search intensified, Sedgwick County officials desperately needed help. That evening, the site was declared a national emergency. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, dispatched a search and rescue team from Lincoln, Nebraska. The team included rescue specialists, physicians, structural engineers, dog team handlers, and more paramedics. Time was critical. If the workers had found air pockets in the mounds of wheat, they would have a limited supply of oxygen. Throughout the night, searchers combed the tunnels for any sign of life. FEMA brought truckloads of state-of-the-art search and rescue gear, including infrared cameras and super-sensitive listening devices. Using a slender pole-mounted camera, they searched beyond narrow crevices and mounds of wheat. Operators manipulated the camera with a joystick, watching on a small TV monitor. They found air pockets, but no signs of survivors. The tunnels were massive, dark, and smoky. Debris made more than 3/4 of them inaccessible. To conduct a thorough search, rescuers had to get the grain out. Structural engineers devised a way to keep grain from funneling down from damaged silos.
Come on, guys. Keep it coming.
To stop the flow of wheat, they pushed sheets of plywood against the ceiling, blocking the silo's mangled release doors. 6-inch timbers held the plywood in place, like vertical beams in a mine shaft. They managed to clear hundreds of yards and reach parts of the tunnels that hadn't been searched. By daybreak, they had brought in massive vacuum trucks to suck out the grain. But hope began to fade when rescuers uncovered the remains of one of the workers. Later, they found 2 more bodies. The violent explosion had killed the workers instantly. They were too badly mutilated to identify. Relatives waited agonizing days for DNA test results, praying for their fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. One by one, they were given the bad news. Only one man remained missing, 65-year-old Howard Going, who had worked at the elevator for 42 years. As they searched for him, Chief Kermode began to worry that they might lose one of their own.
There's always some danger in there, and that's what we look at when we weigh the benefit and risk ratio. If there's more benefit than the risk, then we'll go ahead and do that rescue.
The amount of damage discovered in the recently cleared tunnels made it unlikely that anyone could have survived the blast. While Howard Going's family waited for news, rescue officials debated whether to abandon rescue efforts altogether. Days after an explosion tore through one of the world's largest grain elevators, exhausted firefighters continued to fight the blaze and to search for survivors. At Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, doctors were in the midst of their own rescue operation, struggling to save the lives of critically burned men rescued from the top of the grain elevator. Burn nurse Rhonda Young witnessed the events firsthand.
When it's a mass casualty event, the trauma room is the big focus.
Even as doctors struggled to keep the men from dying of shock or dehydration, they evaluated the extent of the burns. Dr. Gary Jost, director of the Regional Burn Center, treated Scott Mosteller.
We were concerned about the extensive nature of burns to his hands, whether he would actually lose digits or how much damage would be long-term to tendons and joints. We elected to take him to surgery and graft the areas we thought were obvious third degree to the back of his hands.
The medical team administered massive doses of antibiotics to stave off life-threatening infections. They could only wait and hope that the skin grafts worked. At the grain elevator, investigators began to trace the path of the explosion. Although the elevator was filled with rubble, the investigators could reconstruct the blast by examining scorch patterns, warped metal frames, and tracing the trajectory of concrete that hung from rebar or was blasted into open fields. The rescue was growing increasingly hazardous. Because of 100-degree temperatures and heavy clothing, firefighters could only work an hour at a time. Falling debris and tunnel collapses put search teams in constant jeopardy. The investigators' preliminary findings confirmed rescuers' worst fears and forced them to make a decision they had hoped to put off. The first explosion occurred in one of the tunnels, where a seized bearing overheated, igniting grain dust. Within moments, a fireball blasted through the south tunnels, blowing out the ends. The explosion shot up the headhouse tower with astonishing force. Small explosions ignited more dust and transformed the metal doors and conveyor belts into shrapnel. A steel door from the bottom floor was tightly wrapped around a girder more than 100 feet high. The explosions traveled across the top of the structure, shaking dust, then igniting it, transforming silos into 130-foot tall concrete rifle barrels. Howard Goyne never had a chance. Formal rescue efforts were aborted. His son, Robert Goyne, knew the firefighters would have continued rescue efforts if they had any remaining hope of finding his father.
You could just tell by looking at them, their actions, that was the hardest thing that they had to decide on, was to make it a search and recovery instead of a search and rescue operation.
The fire continued to burn as victims' families began to bury their husbands, sons, and fathers. One woman lost her brother and her husband. But the fire hadn't claimed its final victim. On Friday, June 19th, 11 days after the explosion, Lanny Owen died from his injuries. He left behind 2 children. Several weeks after the accident, recovery workers located the body of Howard Goyne. It took months for survivors to recover and rebuild their lives. Because of his burns, Scott Mosteller was unable to return to his job at the elevator. He did return to work, however, at the hospital that saved his life. Firefighters had to remain at the elevator for over a month, extinguishing grain that continued to burn. Few firefighters had ever worked such a massive catastrophe.
It was rated 6 out of 10 of the worst explosions in the world due to size of the structure, the economy, the cost factors. And when you sit back and look at it today, it was one heck of a challenge for any department, whether you're in New York City or whether you're Sedgwick County Fire District number 1.
Each year, firefighters hold a memorial service for the victims. A service that also commemorates their heroic efforts to rescue those who survived.